Welcome to Coffee, the Bible, and Paige. With Paige, your caffeine-imbued host. Thinking with his mouth open since Noah tarred the ark. This podcast is sponsored by Up and Away Junk Hauling, a Christian-owned and operated junk removal service serving the Atlanta area. They offer white-collar service in a blue-collar industry, fair prices, and no-cost estimates, with a commitment to donate and recycle whenever possible. Book online at upandawayjunk.com or call 404-909-4183. Ask for Taylor. He's the owner and a friend of mine. Up and Away Junk Hauling, helping lighten your load. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another fabulous day in the Lord's neighborhood, and welcome to episode 37 in my series on Romans. Before we get started, just the usual caveat. These Bible studies are God teaching Paige what Paige needs to know. I'm not preparing these podcasts to teach my audience anything. I really don't have much of an audience. This is a point of accountability for me. I get up every morning around 5 o'clock and start my day off with time in the Word. That started during the pandemic and when I was housebound for 2.5 years with my heart condition. And it's just turned into a habit. What you get in these devotions, these Bible studies, is like what you get if you were peering through a window and watching me putter around cleaning up my house. You're seeing Paige think the way Paige thinks. I'm addressing issues that these scriptures bring up in my life, and they may not be the same issues that God brings up in your life, but that's okay. Do your own study. The point is, I'm being changed because of my time in the Word. And I'm sharing this with you. If it blesses you, awesome. If you get anything from the words that I speak, that's awesome. So having said that, let's get started. Today we're going to be looking at verses 12 through 14, but I really can't do 12 through 14 unless I repeat what verse 11 said. So I'm going to read 11 through 14, and then we'll see what God unwraps for Paige. Verse 11, Paul said, "In the same way, count yourselves dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. Therefore," in other words, because of what I just said about counting yourself dead to sin, "don't let sin reign in your mortal body, so that you obey its evil desires. Don't offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness. For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. All right, verse 11 and 12. In the same way, count yourselves dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. Therefore, don't let sin reign in your mortal body. Well, verse 12 flows directly out of verse 11. Paul moves from what we are to believe to how we are to live as a result of what we believe. Verse 11 calls us to reckon, to count, to consider ourselves dead to sin and alive to God. And verse 12 is our call to action regarding the sin in our lives. In other words, if you truly believe that sin is no longer your ruler, that you're indeed dead to sin, and Satan is no longer your master, then act like it. Let me give you a personal example. When I first surrendered my life to Christ, I smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. From the moment I was saved, I knew I should quit. The problem was that nicotine is one of the most addictive substances on earth, and for me, quitting felt nearly impossible. It took over 2 years. At the time, I didn't understand what I was doing. But looking back, I can see the principle of Romans 6 at work. Whenever the urge to smoke came, I would ask myself this question. I don't know why I asked myself this question. I hadn't studied any books or anything, self-help things, but I'd ask this question. What would I do right now if I didn't crave a cigarette? The answer was obvious. I wouldn't light one up. So I would act as though I were not a smoker. I would simply do what a non-smoker would do. Not light up. Remember verse 11 when he said, count yourselves dead to sin but alive to God? Well, my paraphrase, remember that? Since you've been united with Christ in his death and resurrection, continually regard that as your true identity. Consider yourselves no longer under sin's authority, but living a new life towards God. Live as if sin had no power. That's exactly where Paul is leading us. What would you do if sin were no longer your king? Do that. What would you do if you truly believe that Christ was your new master and the power of sin was kicked out the door? Do that. That's the essence of 11 and 12. Embrace the truth of your new identity. Because that's the truth. Then live in a way that's consistent with that identity. The deed flows from the thought. The behavior flows from the belief. Because you no longer are under sin's rule, refuse to let sin rule you. In other words, are you a new creature? Act like it. Now, verse 13 and 14, he says, don't offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who've been brought from death to life. Offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness, for sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. Well, verse 11 and 12 said, you're no longer under sin's rule, act like it. Verse 13 and 14, what I just read to you, and this is what that looks like. I'm gonna work these 2 verses backwards. I'm going to look at verse 14 first, because it's the reason that we can successfully act out verse 13. 14 says, for sin shall no longer be your master, because you're not under the law, but under grace. Verse 14, well, it's plainly simple. We have a new king. This king is no longer our adversary, but is our ally in our fight against the sin of our life. One of the benefits of being under grace is that we now have unfettered access to his power. The law, as Paul has previously explained, reveals our sin and our hopeless position when it comes to dealing with that sin. Now that we've moved from being under the law to being under grace and to becoming subjects of a king who rules through that grace, Paul's explaining how that process works. In verse 13, he's saying, because sin is no longer your master. Since that's true, don't offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness. Offer yourselves to God as those who've been brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness. Now, what does what I just read, verse 13, mean to the RLR Christian when Paul says, don't offer any part of yourselves to sin as an instrument of wickedness? I'll get back to the RLR in a bit. But the Greek text reads, imagine me reading Greek, which I don't. We're going to look at some key words, though. He says, do not offer any part of yourself to sin. The verb do not offer means to present, to place at someone's disposal, to make available, to put at another one's service. It was often used to placing something before a person for their use. The idea is not passive surrender, but active availability. Paul is saying, stop putting yourself at sin's disposal. Stop making yourselves available for sin's use. Notice that Paul does not say believers must create a sin. No, sin's already looking for opportunities. The issue is whether we will hand over our members for its use. Well, the word members is translated NIV, part of yourself. He says, do not offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness. It literally means members, body parts. Paul's talking about every faculty that we possess: eyes, ears, tongue, hands, feet, mind, imagination, emotions. Every part of life can be placed at someone's disposal. He says, don't offer any part of yourselves to sin as an instrument of wickedness. Well, this is one of the most interesting words in this verse. The word translated instrument is often used for military equipment, weapons, instruments of warfare. Paul is not picturing harmless tools lying in a toolbox. He's picturing weapons being handed to an army. You have weapons at your disposal. Your eyes become weapons. Your tongue becomes a weapon. Your hands become weapons. Your mind becomes a weapon. The question is not whether your life will be used in the battle. The question is, whose side will wield, whose side will wield that weapon? Your life, your eyes, your hands, your mind, your tongue. Oh. Do not offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness. Well, this word translated wickedness means unrighteousness, injustice, wrongdoing, conduct contrary to God's will. When we place our members at sin's disposal, well, they become weapons used in real rebellion against God. So, here's the RLR-MTR connection. RLR-MTR means real life rubber meets the road. It's the attitude that searches for what really works in our lives, practically, not merely a fancy-sounding theory. Here's what this RLR-MTR looks like in light of what we just read. Before Christ, we lived under the reign of sin. We naturally handed everything about ourselves over to sin's service. Our eyes looked for sinful things. Our mouths spoke sinful words. Our minds entertained sinful thoughts. We were loyal subjects to the old kingdom. We willingly went where our sin led us. But Romans 6 teaches that the RLR-MTR Christian, real life rubber meets the road, has experienced a change of rulers. Sin is no longer king. Christ is king. Therefore, Paul's not telling us to become something we're not. He's telling us to stop acting as though the old ruler is still on the throne. A useful paraphrase might be, don't keep placing your eyes, ears, tongue, hands, mind, and body at the disposal of your former king as weapons for his rebellion. You belong to a new king now. Or, in RLR-MTR language, if sin is really no longer your ruler, don't act like it is. What are you habitually saying that opposes God? Well, let's work on that. What habits do you have that glorify anything other than God? Let's work on that. I used to be an engineer in the communications world. I loved taking something broken and getting it working again. I loved the challenge of bringing it back to its former glory. But if I'm reading Paul correctly, he seems to be telling me that to get to the new me that represents Christ fully in this life, the correct approach is first to realize that I am a new creature. Not going to be. I am a new creature. In truth, the old me is beyond repair. I need to begin with the thought, in Christ, I am a new creature. Start there. Now, what does that mean in the context of whatever sin I'm dealing with? Well, again, I look back at my struggle with smoking. I was addicted to nicotine. It was not an easy battle to fight. It took over 2 years to win it. But it began with me asking myself this question you've read about here. What if I were not addicted to smoking? What would I do? Then I acted like I was not addicted to smoking. What situations lent themselves to me wanting to smoke? Avoid those situations. This is not an easy thing. It was warfare. I was in a battle against the nicotine addiction. Now, Paul talks elsewhere of Christians needing armor, like Ephesians 6, because we are in a war. Wars are not easy. They're dangerous. There's battles. There's weaponry involved. You need your eyes, your ears, your mind, your limbs, everything. Here are some places that Paul uses this imagery of a soldier's weaponry as necessary implements for the Christian. In Romans 6, we're just reading it, the believer's body becomes a weapon for righteousness. Your members, your hands, your eyes, your ears, your nose, mouth, everything. In Romans 13, we'll get to later, he talks about putting on the armor of light. We'll see what that means later. In 1 Thessalonians 5, faith, love, and hope are pieces of armor. 2 Corinthians 10, spiritual warfare requires spiritual weapons. Ephesians 6, the most complete description of the Christian's armor and the believer's battle against spiritual forces. What this tells me is that what Paul is teaching here in Romans 6 goes way beyond a spiritual pep talk. Think it and be it. We are warriors in a cosmic battle. This is not a positive mental attitude refresher course. No, we're in a battle, and we have weapons. These weapons are the basic Christian disciplines: prayer, fellowship, meditation, etc. But it all begins with consider yourself dead to sin. It starts with a conscious decision on my part that I'm a warrior and I serve a new king. In Romans chapter 6, Paul lays a foundation for our faith walk. It begins with us understanding that we are no longer under the rule of sin. The believer's task is not to become someone new. Christ has already made us new. The believer's task is to stop presenting himself to the old ruler and the old ways and start living as a loyal subject of the new king. Now, I'm not totally satisfied with how I've unwrapped what Paul is saying here. Further understanding will come in time. Currently, it is enough to know that Paul is telling me to rethink what it means to be a new creature in Christ, to no longer be hopelessly subject to sin. And then he's challenging me to act like it. There's no neutrality in Christian life. And when he gives this verb to offer or present your members to one side or the other, it appears twice in verse 13. First, negatively, don't present yourself to sin. And then positively, present yourselves to God. God doesn't envision a neutral life. Every day, we are placing ourselves at someone's disposal. The only question is whether our members become weapons in sin's rebellion or instruments in God's service. That idea fits remarkably well with the RLMR, MTR, real life, rubber meets the road, theme of transferring allegiance from the old ruler to the rightful king. In other words, the real life, rubber meets the road Christian is called to reflect on the outside what has happened on our inside. Our lives should reflect the new king we serve. Paul says, act like it. That's a good place to stop. There's a lot there. Here's my coffee. Remember, in the beginning, coffee, and lo, it was very good. Feel free to go to my site, www.coffeebiblepage.com, to catch up on my other podcast episodes. And go to Amazon.com and look for my Essays in Romans series by Paige Garwood. And you can find the workbooks that go along with all of these lessons. I'm Paige, and I am out of here. Have a glorious day. Bye-bye. You have been watching or listening to Coffee, the Bible and Paige with your host, Paige C. Garwood. thinking with his mouth open since 1975.